At my own dinner table, my seat was gone and my daughter-in-law told me the kitchen was where I belonged. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask a question. I just stood there, holding the serving dish I had spent all afternoon preparing, feeling the heat from it press into my palms as if it were the only thing keeping me steady. The room smelled like rosemary, chicken, and fresh bread, the same recipes I had made for over 30 years, the same meals that used to bring everyone to the table early, smiling, asking what I needed help with. But that night, no one moved. No one offered me a chair. Daniel kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his food into careful, quiet pieces like he was trying not to make a sound. Rebecca sat in my seat at the head of the table, like she had always belonged there, like I had already disappeared. "You'll be more comfortable in the kitchen," she added lightly, as if she were doing me a favor, as if this were a small adjustment and not something that shifted the ground beneath my feet. I nodded. Just once. Then I turned and walked back into the kitchen without another word. The tile felt colder than I remembered under my feet, even through my shoes, and the hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded louder than the laughter that drifted in from the dining room behind me. I set the dish down slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might crack something open that I wasn't ready to face yet. From where I stood, I could still see the edge of the table, the flicker of candlelight reflecting off the glassware I had polished that morning, the outline of the chair that used to be mine. I had chosen those chairs myself years ago, when my husband and I first bought this house, back when every decision felt shared, back when that table meant something. I leaned my hands against the counter and stared at the sink, at the clean, empty basin that waited like it had already accepted where I had been placed. Behind me, their voices blended together, low and easy, like nothing had happened, like this was normal. And maybe to them it was. That was the part that settled in slowly, heavier than the moment itself. This hadn't started tonight. This was just the first time they said it out loud. I reached for a towel that didn't need folding and ran it through my hands anyway, buying myself a few more seconds to breathe, to think, to understand what I had just been shown. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry, not yet. What I felt was something quieter, something colder. Clarity. I had spent years believing that if I kept things together, if I stayed patient, if I made myself useful, I would always have a place at that table. But standing there in my own kitchen, listening to them carry on without me, I realized something I should have seen a long time ago. They hadn't just taken my seat. They had already decided I didn't belong there anymore. And the most dangerous part wasn't that they believed it. It was that they thought I didn't see it. I dried my hands on the towel, even though they weren't wet, and glanced once more toward the dining room, toward the life I had built piece by piece. Then I turned back to the counter, my reflection faint in the dark window above the sink, and allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Because if they thought moving me to the kitchen was the end of my place in this house, then they had just made their first mistake. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, listening without meaning to, catching fragments of conversation that floated in and out like they had nothing to hide, and that was what made it worse, the ease of it. The way Rebecca laughed softly as she poured herself more wine, the way Daniel responded with quiet agreement instead of hesitation, as if this arrangement had already been settled somewhere I had not been invited to. Somewhere decisions about me had been made without ever once including me, and I realized then that this was not about one chair or one comment. This was about a shift that had been happening slowly, carefully, over time, the kind you do not notice until it is complete. I dried the same clean plate twice before setting it down, then reached for another just to keep my hands busy, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant replaying every small moment that now seemed different, every time Rebecca had stepped in to answer a question directed at me, every time Daniel had said, "We have already decided," instead of asking what I thought, every time I had told myself it was nothing, that families changed, that I needed to adapt, that love sometimes looked quieter than it used to. From the kitchen doorway, I glanced back again, just enough to see how naturally she leaned into my space, how easily she spoke to guests like she was the one who had built this home, like she knew its stories, like she had earned that place at the head of the table. And, for a moment, I wondered if maybe I had simply stayed too long, if this was what happened when time moved forward and I did not move with it, but that thought did not sit right, not when I remembered the years I had poured into this house, the holidays I had hosted, the birthdays I had planned down to the smallest detail, the nights I had stayed up late making sure everything ran smoothly so no one else had to worry. That was not something that simply faded away without acknowledgement. Not unless someone chose to ignore it. The laughter at the table rose again, louder this time, and I heard Rebecca say something about needing more space, about how things had to change if they were going to move forward, and there was a pause after that, the kind that waits for agreement. And Daniel gave it to her, quietly, without resistance, and that was when it settled fully into place, not as a suspicion, not as a fear, but as a certainty. They were not just adjusting the way things worked in this house, they were preparing for something that required me to be moved out of the center and into the background, something that needed me to accept less without asking why. I folded the towel again, slower this time, pressing each edge carefully as if precision could hold everything together, and I thought about the documents in the study drawer, the ones I had not looked at in months, the ones my husband had insisted I keep organized. Just in case, and a memory surfaced, quiet but clear, of him telling me once that understanding your own home was just as important as caring for it, that nothing should ever catch me off guard, and I had nodded back then, thinking it was simply practical advice, but standing there now, with their voices drifting behind me and that empty chair still waiting in the dining room, I understood it differently. I set the towel down and rested my hands against the counter again, letting the cool surface ground me, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to stop pretending that this was temporary, that this would pass if I stayed patient long enough. Because patience was exactly what had brought me here, and it was not going to take me back. I did not need to confront them, not yet, and I did not need to ask questions that would only give them time to adjust their answers. What I needed was to see clearly, to listen carefully, to let them believe that I had accepted my place exactly where they had put me, because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that people reveal far more when they think you are no longer paying attention. And as I stood there in the quiet of my own kitchen, I realized that for the first time, I finally was. I did not return to the table that night, and no one came looking for me, which told me more than any conversation could have, because in this house, there had always been a rhythm, a quiet understanding that if one of us stepped away, the others would notice, would pause, would ask if everything was all right, but that rhythm was gone now, replaced by something smoother, more controlled, something that did not include me unless I stayed exactly where I was expected to be. I cleaned the kitchen slowly, methodically, rinsing dishes that were already clean, aligning them in the rack with careful precision, listening to the way their voices carried on without interruption, as if the evening had not shifted at all, as if I had simply faded into the background where I belonged. When the laughter finally softened and chairs began to scrape lightly against the floor, I stepped back just enough to stay out of sight, not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to see what they did when they thought I was no longer watching. Rebecca's voice came first, calm and measured, the same tone she used when she was explaining something that had already been decided, and I heard her say that changes like this took time, that it was better to ease into them rather than make everything obvious all at once, and there was a quiet murmur of agreement that followed, not enthusiastic, not resistant, just accepting, and that was what settled it for me, the understanding that this was not a spontaneous moment, not a slip of the tongue or a careless gesture, but part of something deliberate, something that had been discussed and shaped and agreed upon long before tonight. Daniel said very little, but when he did speak, it was not to question her, not to defend me, but to confirm details, to ask about timing, about what would come next, and I felt something inside me shift again, not breaking this time, but aligning, like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place in a way that could not be undone. I stepped into the hallway as they began to move toward the living room, keeping my expression neutral, my posture relaxed, as if I had simply been occupied with the dishes, as if I had heard nothing at all, and Rebecca smiled at me in passing, a soft, polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, the kind that acknowledged my presence without truly seeing me, and I returned it just as calmly, because there was no reason to show her anything different, not yet. The house felt different as the evening wore on, not in its structure or its familiar details, but in the way I moved through it, more aware, more attentive, noticing things I had overlooked before. Like the folder on the coffee table that had not been there that morning, the way Rebecca's handbag stayed close to her side even when she stood, the brief glance she exchanged with Daniel when they thought no one was looking, small things, ordinary things. But together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore once I allowed myself to see it. Later, when the guests had left and the house settled into a quieter stillness, I walked past the dining room again, pausing just long enough to look at the table as it stood now, the candles burned low, the chairs slightly out of place. My seat no longer marked by anything except absence, and I realized that what they had taken from me was not just a position at the table, but the assumption that I would always accept whatever place they assigned me without question. I turned away from the room and made my way down the hallway toward the study, my steps steady, unhurried, because there was no longer any reason to rush, no need to react in the moment when the truth had already revealed itself so clearly. As I reached the door, I paused with my hand on the handle, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, understanding that whatever I chose to do next would not be about reclaiming a chair or correcting a single moment, but about addressing something far deeper, something that had been quietly rearranged in my own home while I believed everything was still in its place. I opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of old paper and polished wood grounding me, and for the first time that night, I felt something close to certainty, not about them, but about myself, about what I was willing to see, and what I would no longer ignore. I closed the study door behind me and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me in a way it had not all evening, a different kind of silence, one that did not feel like exclusion but like space, like something waiting to be understood rather than ignored, and I moved slowly toward the desk, my fingers brushing along its surface as I passed, remembering how many evenings I had spent here with my husband, reviewing bills, organizing paperwork, making plans that always included the future as something shared, something secure, something that could not be quietly rewritten by anyone else. I pulled open the top drawer and found everything exactly where I had left it, folders neatly arranged, documents stacked with careful intention, a system that had once seemed almost excessive but now felt like the only steady thing left in the house. And I sat down, drawing one folder out and opening it with a calm that surprised me, because there was no panic, no rush, only a steady need to see clearly what I had not looked at in far too long. As I turned the first page, I could hear faint movement down the hallway, the low murmur of voices continuing, and I realized they were not worried about what I was doing, not even curious, because in their minds, I had already been placed somewhere predictable, somewhere harmless. And that assumption gave me something they did not realize they had given me: time. I read slowly, carefully, taking in each line without skipping ahead, noticing the dates, the signatures, the details that spoke of ownership and responsibility, and with each page, that quiet clarity grew stronger. Because nothing here suggested that I had been replaced, nothing here indicated that my place in this house had changed in any official sense, which meant that everything happening outside this room was built on something else, something unspoken, something they were counting on me not to question. I paused and leaned back slightly, letting my eyes rest on the familiar shelves lining the walls, filled with books and small keepsakes that told the story of a life built piece by piece, not handed over, not borrowed, but earned. And I thought about the way Rebecca had spoken earlier, the ease of her words, the confidence that came from believing she was already in control, and I understood now that her confidence was not based on fact, but on assumption, on the belief that I would remain exactly as I had always been, accommodating, patient, unwilling to disrupt the peace even when the peace no longer included me. I closed the folder gently and set it aside, not because I was finished, but because I had seen enough for the moment, enough to know that the situation was not what it appeared to be on the surface, and that the real shift was not in the paperwork, but in perception, in who they believed held authority and who did not. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened yard where everything remained unchanged. The same trees, the same quiet stillness. Reminder that not everything had been altered just because they had begun to act as though it had. And I rested my hand lightly against the glass, feeling the coolness beneath my palm as I considered what came next. There was no need to confront them tonight, no advantage in revealing what I now understood, because the strength of what I held came from their lack of awareness, from the space they had created by underestimating me, and I intended to use that space carefully, deliberately, without haste. I turned back toward the desk and gathered the folder, placing it neatly where it had been, restoring everything to its original order, because nothing needed to look different yet. Nothing needed to signal that anything had changed on my side, even though everything had. As I reached for the light, I paused once more, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, understanding that the evening had not taken something from me, as it had first seemed, but had revealed something instead. Something that had been hidden beneath routine and assumption for longer than I cared to admit, and with that realization came a quiet resolve, steady and certain, that whatever they believed about my place in this house, whatever plans they thought were already set in motion, they had overlooked one simple fact: I was still here, and I was no longer unaware. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because something inside me had already shifted into motion, quiet and steady, and I moved through the house with the same familiar routine, making coffee, opening the blinds, letting the morning light settle into the rooms as if nothing had changed, as if the previous night had been nothing more than an ordinary dinner. And when Rebecca came into the kitchen, she paused for just a second, surprised to find everything already done, the table cleared, the counters spotless, the coffee ready, and I greeted her with the same calm tone I had always used, the same polite warmth that gave nothing away. She studied me briefly, as if trying to measure something she could not quite name, then smiled and reached for a cup, and I noticed the way her eyes moved, quick and observant, the way she seemed to check for any sign of resistance, any hint that I had taken offense. But I offered none, not even a flicker, because there was no advantage in letting her know that anything had changed on my side. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, still quiet, still careful, and he asked about the evening as if it had been normal, as if I had not been moved out of my own place at the table, and I answered just as simply, telling him the meal had turned out well, that everyone seemed to enjoy it, and he nodded. Relieved perhaps, or simply uninterested in looking any deeper, and that told me something too, that whatever this plan was, it depended on my silence just as much as their actions. The day moved forward in small, ordinary moments, but I paid attention to everything now: the phone calls Rebecca stepped outside to take, the way she lowered her voice when speaking in the living room, the way certain words stood out even when I was not meant to hear them. Words like timeline, paperwork, and space, always space, as if that single idea justified everything they were doing. By late afternoon, I found myself back in the study, not out of habit this time, but with intention, and I opened the drawer again, this time pulling out a second folder, one I had not needed to review in years, and I went through it carefully, confirming what I had begun to understand the night before, that nothing had been transferred, nothing had been reassigned, that legally and clearly, everything remained exactly as it had always been, and that meant the only power they held was the power I allowed them to believe they had. I closed the folder and sat there for a moment, letting that settle fully, because it changed everything, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that required immediate action, but in a way that gave me control over how this would unfold, and control, I realized, did not come from confrontation, it came from timing. That evening, when Rebecca mentioned another dinner later in the week, suggesting it casually, as if it were just another gathering, I agreed without hesitation, my voice steady, my expression unchanged, and I saw the brief look she exchanged with Daniel. A look that carried satisfaction, as if my agreement confirmed something for them, as if it meant I had accepted the new arrangement without question, and I let them believe that, because belief can be a powerful thing when it is built on the wrong foundation. As the house settled into quiet again, I moved through each room with a different awareness, noticing not just what was there, but what had been assumed, what had been taken for granted. And I understood now that this was no longer about holding on to a place that had been slowly taken from me. It was about deciding how and when to remind them that it had never truly been theirs to take in the first place. And as I turned off the last light and stood in the stillness of the hallway, I felt something settle into place within me. Not anger, not sadness, but something far more useful, patience with purpose. By the second day, I no longer had to search for signs. They revealed themselves without effort, in the rhythm of their movements, in the quiet coordination between them that had once included me and now clearly did not. And I began to notice how often Rebecca positioned herself as the one who answered before Daniel even had a chance to speak, how naturally she framed decisions as already agreed upon, how easily she redirected conversations when they drifted too close to anything that might involve me directly. I did not interrupt. I did not question. I simply listened, storing each detail with the same care I once used to plan family gatherings, because understanding people has always been about what they show when they believe no one is paying attention. That afternoon, while Rebecca was on the phone in the living room, her voice lowered, but not quite enough. I passed by slowly, not stopping, not appearing to linger, but catching just enough to confirm what I had already begun to piece together. Words like appraisal and listing floated into place, followed by a softer mention of timing, and then a brief pause before she said, almost casually, that everything would be easier once the house was officially theirs to manage, and I kept walking, my expression unchanged, as if I had heard nothing at all, even though that single sentence settled something firmly within me. Later, Daniel approached me in the kitchen, his tone careful, almost rehearsed, asking if I had ever considered downsizing, framing it as a practical question, something reasonable. Something that made sense for someone my age, and I turned toward him with the same calm I had carried since that night, telling him that I had not given it much thought, that this house had suited me just fine for many years, and he nodded quickly, as if he had expected resistance, but was relieved not to find it, and that reaction told me everything I needed to know about how they saw me now, not as someone who would challenge them, but as someone who would quietly accept whatever direction they suggested. I returned to the study again that evening, but this time I did not open any drawers right away. I simply stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle, considering not just what I knew, but how best to use it. Because knowledge on its own changes nothing unless it is placed carefully at the right moment, in the right way. When I finally sat down, I reached for the phone instead of the files, dialing a number I had not used in some time, and when the familiar voice answered, I spoke clearly, calmly, setting a meeting for later that week, not explaining everything, not yet. Just enough to begin putting things in motion beyond the walls of this house, because whatever Rebecca and Daniel believed they were building here, it existed only within the space I allowed them to control, and I had no intention of leaving that space undefined any longer. The following morning, when Rebecca mentioned again how important it was for everyone to be on the same page, I agreed, meeting her eyes with a steady expression that gave her nothing to question, and I saw that same brief satisfaction return. The quiet confidence of someone who believes the outcome is already secured, and I let it remain, because certainty can be the most fragile thing when it is built on assumptions that have never been tested. As the day moved forward, I continued as I always had, preparing meals, maintaining the house, moving through each room with the same care and attention. But beneath that routine, something else had taken shape, something deliberate, something patient. And for the first time in a long while, I understood that what mattered was not where I stood in any single moment, but what I chose to do next, and how long I was willing to let them believe that nothing had changed at all. The meeting was set for Thursday morning, and I made sure nothing about my routine suggested that anything out of the ordinary was taking place, because the strength of what I was building depended entirely on their belief that I remained exactly where they had placed me, predictable, accommodating, unaware, and over the next 2 days, I continued to watch without appearing to do so, noticing how Rebecca began to move with a quiet urgency now, as if something were approaching a deadline, how She organized papers on the dining room table when she thought I was occupied elsewhere, how she spoke more frequently in terms of next steps rather than possibilities, and each time I passed by, I offered the same calm presence, never slowing, never questioning, allowing her to grow more confident in the assumption that nothing stood in her way. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed more careful, more measured, as if some part of him understood that what they were doing required a level of silence that did not come naturally, and there were moments when he looked at me as though he might say something, as though he might try to explain or soften what was coming, but each time, he chose not to, and that choice, repeated quietly over and over, told me more about where he stood than any words ever could. On Wednesday evening, Rebecca mentioned the dinner again, the one she had suggested earlier in the week, and this time she framed it more clearly, saying it would be good for everyone to sit down together and discuss the future of the house. Her tone careful but deliberate, and I nodded as if this were exactly what I had been expecting, as if I welcomed the idea, and I agreed without hesitation, because by then, I understood that this dinner was not just a gathering. It was a moment they had been preparing for, a point where everything they had assumed would be spoken aloud and presented as something final. That night, I returned to the study one last time before my meeting, not to search for anything new, but to confirm what I already knew, to ground myself in the reality that existed beyond their plans, and I reviewed the documents again, slowly, deliberately, tracing the details that made everything clear, everything certain, and when I closed the folder, I did so with a sense of calm that had nothing to do with denial and everything to do with understanding. Thursday morning arrived quietly, the house still as I prepared to leave, and when Rebecca asked where I was going, I told her I had an appointment, nothing more, nothing less, and she nodded, distracted, already focused on something else, something she believed was more important, and I stepped out into the morning air with a steadiness I had not felt in a long time. The meeting itself was brief but precise, every question answered, every detail clarified, and when I left, I carried with me not just confirmation, but direction, a clear path forward that did not depend on their assumptions or their timeline, but on something far more reliable. By the time I returned home, the house felt the same as it always had, quiet, familiar, unchanged on the surface, but I moved through it differently now, not as someone trying to hold on to what was slipping away, but as someone who understood exactly what had always been hers and what had never truly been offered to anyone else. That evening, as Rebecca finalized preparations for the dinner she believed would secure everything, I watched from a distance, offering help when it was convenient, stepping back when it was not, and I could see the certainty in her movements. The way she arranged the table, the way she positioned each chair, including mine, not at the head where it had always been, but slightly to the side, a subtle shift that spoke volumes about what she expected to happen next, and I said nothing, because there was no need to correct her, not yet, not when allowing her to believe in that arrangement would make what came after all the more clear, all the more final, and as the evening settled in and the house prepared for what they believed would be a defining moment, I found myself standing in the hallway once more, not uncertain, not hesitant, but ready, because for the first time since that night at the table I knew exactly where I stood, and more importantly, I knew exactly where they did not. The evening arrived with a kind of quiet precision, every detail arranged exactly as Rebecca had intended, the table set carefully, the lighting softened just enough to make everything feel composed, deliberate, and when I stepped into the dining room, I noticed immediately how each chair had been placed, how each setting had been aligned, and there it was again, my seat, no longer at the head of the table where it had always been, but positioned slightly to the side, close enough to appear included, far enough to signal something had changed, and I paused just long enough to take it in before moving forward, my expression calm, unreadable, offering no resistance, no hesitation, because this was the moment they had been building toward, the moment they believed would confirm everything they had quietly decided. Rebecca greeted me with a measured smile, her voice smooth as she invited everyone to sit, guiding the flow of the evening with a confidence that came from certainty, and Daniel followed her lead, his movements restrained but aligned, as if he had already accepted whatever outcome this dinner was meant to produce. I took my place without comment, the one they had chosen for me, folding my hands lightly in my lap as the conversation began, casual at first, almost rehearsed in its normalcy, as if they needed to ease into what was coming rather than confront it directly, and I listened, not interrupting, not rushing, allowing them the space to reveal exactly what they believed I was ready to hear. The conversation shifted slowly, moving from small talk to something more structured, and Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her tone soft but firm as she began to speak about the future, about practicality, about how important it was for everyone to be comfortable and secure, and I watched the way she chose her words, careful, calculated, designed to sound reasonable while guiding the discussion in a very specific direction, and when she mentioned the house, when she spoke about managing it properly, about making decisions that reflected where things were headed, I felt that quiet clarity return, stronger now, not because of what she was saying, but because of how certain she sounded that it would be accepted without question. Daniel added to it then, his voice quieter, explaining that they had been thinking about what would be best moving forward, about how the space could be used more efficiently, about how things might need to change, and there was a brief pause after that. A silence that waited for my response, that expected hesitation, confusion, maybe even resistance, but I gave them none of that. I simply nodded once, slowly, as if I understood exactly what they were trying to say, and that seemed to encourage them, to confirm their belief that everything was unfolding as planned. Rebecca continued, more directly now, explaining that it might be better if I considered a smaller place, something easier to maintain, something more suitable, and the words settled into the room with a kind of finality, as if they had already been agreed upon, as if this was simply the moment of acknowledgement rather than the beginning of a discussion. I let the silence linger for a moment, just long enough to feel its weight, just long enough for them to believe that I was considering it in the way they expected, and then I reached forward, adjusting the napkin beside my plate with deliberate care. A small movement that grounded the moment without breaking it, and I looked up, meeting Rebecca's eyes for the first time that evening with a steady calm that did not challenge her, but did not yield either. Around us, the room remained still, every detail exactly as she had arranged it, every expectation quietly waiting to be fulfilled, and I realized then that this dinner was not the turning point they believed it to be. Not the moment where I would accept a place they had chosen for me, but something else entirely, something they had not accounted for, because while they had prepared every part of this evening with careful intention, they had done so based on one assumption that had never been tested, that I would remain exactly where they had placed me, and as I sat there, listening, observing, allowing them to speak without interruption, I understood that the most powerful thing I could do in that moment was not to respond too soon, not to correct them before they finished, but to let them believe, just a little longer, that everything was still under their control. I let the silence settle just a moment longer, long enough for Rebecca's confidence to rise to its natural peak, long enough for Daniel to shift slightly in his chair as if bracing for a response he believed would follow a predictable path. And then I reached for my glass, not to drink, but to give myself a measured pause, a small, controlled movement that drew their attention without breaking the calm of the room, and when I set it back down, I spoke, my voice even, steady and clear in a way that did not ask for permission. I told them I understood their concerns, that I appreciated how much thought they had clearly put into discussing the future, and I watched the brief flicker of relief cross Daniel's face, the subtle satisfaction in Rebecca's expression, as if they believed this was the beginning of agreement, as if they had already succeeded in guiding me exactly where they wanted me to go, and I allowed that belief to remain for just a second longer before continuing. I said that I had also been thinking about the future, that I had taken some time over the past few days to review a few things, and at that, Rebecca's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, not alarmed, not yet, but attentive, as if something in my tone had not aligned with the response she had expected, and Daniel glanced at her briefly before looking back at me, waiting. I folded my hands lightly on the table, not in defense, not in hesitation, but in quiet certainty, and I explained that I had met with someone that morning, someone who had helped me go over the details of the house, the ownership, the structure of everything that had been put in place years ago, and I did not rush my words. I let each one settle fully before moving to the next, because clarity does not need to be loud to be understood. The room grew still, the kind of stillness that does not come from peace, but from recognition, and I could see it begin to form in Rebecca's eyes, that first small crack in certainty, the moment when expectation starts to shift into something else. I continued, calmly, explaining that nothing about the house had changed, not legally, not structurally, not in any way that would support the direction they had been discussing, and I said it without accusation, without raising my voice, simply as a fact. Something that existed regardless of what any of us believed, and Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression tightening as he processed what I had just said, while Rebecca remained still, her gaze fixed on me, measuring, recalculating. I added then, just as evenly, that while I understood their desire to plan ahead, decisions about this house were not something that could be made casually, not something that could be assumed, because this home was not an open space waiting to be reassigned. It was something that had been defined clearly, deliberately, and with intention long before this conversation had ever begun. I did not need to explain every detail. I did not need to present documents or raise my voice, because the shift had already happened, not in the room itself, but in the balance of understanding, and I could feel it settle, quietly but completely, as the certainty they had carried into this dinner began to dissolve into something less stable. I reached for my napkin then, adjusting it with the same calm precision I had used earlier, and I met Rebecca's eyes once more, not with challenge, not with anger, but with a steady clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, and in that moment, I realized that nothing about this had required force, nothing about it had required confrontation in the way they might have expected, because the truth, placed carefully at the right time, had done exactly what it needed to do. The room remained quiet, no one rushing to fill the space, no one quite ready to speak, and I allowed that silence to remain, because it belonged to them now, not to me, and as I sat there, composed, certain, exactly where I had chosen to be, I understood that the seat they had moved me from had never defined my place in this house, and the position they had tried to give me had never truly been mine to accept.